Hey, did you know that over 90% of our viewers watch our videos but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these true trucker horror stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. It's free and really motivates us to keep the stories rolling. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's stories. The road tonight feels heavier, the kind that hums with memories best left forgotten. Welcome to the Sleep Haunt, where truth and terror ride side by side. Tonight, we bring you 6 true most disturbing trucker horror stories, chilling encounters from desolate highways, shadowed rest stops, and long nights when something unholy followed the sound of the engine. Before we begin, we've set a goal. Let's reach 100 likes on this video. Tap that like button now, settle in, breathe slow, and listen. The road remembers everything. Story number 1. Mason had been running desert miles for years, and the Mojave at night felt like a familiar ocean. The highway lifted and fell in slow swells, a dark ribbon braided with the faint red wink of distant towers and the white blink of wind turbines far off like quiet metronomes. The air in the cab held the warmth of the afternoon, a soft baked smell rising from the dash whenever he turned the defroster on low. His thermos rattled gently in its holder. The radio, tuned low to a CB channel that no one was really using out there, kept up a steady hush of static-like breath. He liked this time after midnight, before the sudden pearl gray wash of the hour when the horizon starts thinking about dawn. It was the hour when mile markers were companions. The world got simple. The yellow arcs of his headlights, the dotted white line, the occasional reflective sign that stood up and flashed its simple little truth and then slid behind. Somewhere beyond a dry lake bed, after an exit for a town that was mostly an idea and a boarded diner, he saw the first cone. Just one, bright and clean, sitting where the shoulder sloped away. The next appeared 100 yards later, and then a third. He eased off the cruise without thinking, just a few miles per hour, and the engine settled into a slightly lower note. A lit arrow board blinked ahead in the median, an amber chevron sweeping left and left again, calm as a metronome. A maintenance truck idled beyond it with no one visible. The sign on the back pushed its amber glow into the night, and the cones tightened to a proper line. The message sign pulsed. Emergency detour. And then, smaller, a direction to exit at the forthcoming ramp and use the frontage road. Mason checked the route on his dash tablet. No detours listed, no closures. But the sign had the county seal and the font he recognized. And he'd learned not to argue with orange cones. He signaled, took the ramp, and rolled down to the frontage road and the arrow that pointed east. He didn't see any workers. He didn't hear the thump-thump of an air compressor or the cold clink of tools. The only sound was the whisper of his own tires and the occasional skitter of grit against his fenders when the wind picked up. The frontage road ran close enough to the highway that he could see 3 semis ghost along the main lanes, their trailers glowing white as they passed. A moment later, the highway dipped away, and the frontage road kept on alone. The cones reappeared, in neat pairs now, guiding him through a gentle curve. Every one of them was spotless. That was a small thing, but it struck him. Out here, cones got dusty fast. The wind saw to that. These glowed like they'd just come out of the stack. Mason felt his shoulder blades find that small ridge of tension they got on long nights and rolled them, took a sip of coffee, and kept going. The CB burped softly. He hadn't heard anything for an hour. Then it crackled again, and a voice said, "Eastbound. You're doing fine." The tone was friendly, a touch of humor beneath a sleepy drawl. Mason thumbed the mic and said thanks, asked for an update on the detour. No answer. The hiss returned, patient as a tide. The cones led him past a rest area he knew well. One of those older ones with a low building and a row of trees planted in a straight line like a marching band. The entry was blocked by a sawhorse and a shuttered electric sign that was still faintly backlit, a pale square in the dark, with no letters showing. In the glow from his headlights, he could see the automatic doors, the kind with a worn strip where countless hands had brushed them, and inside, a faint green exit sign over a hallway. The drinking fountain near the map kiosk had a small paper cup left upside down over the spout. He coasted past and felt the familiar itch to pull in and stretch. He pushed on. The cones narrowed again. The air outside the cab had a strange stillness to it, as if the wind had moved away from this strip of ground and had forgotten to return. His mirrors showed nothing but a clean tunnel of dark behind him. He flicked the high beams and watched the asphalt brighten and recede. The striping looked freshly painted. He didn't like that either. He hadn't seen a crew. The truck's speedometer sat at a steady number. The clock on the dash ticked its minutes forward, and yet the same knuckled hill lay ahead, the same scarred basalt on the right, the same sign face down in the sage. Familiar, but not like déjà vu. More like seeing a face in a crowd twice, and realizing the eyes are not the same color the second time. He went 2 more miles. He counted them out. The cones described a broad, slow left, and brought him to a wooden gate with a chain looped through but not locked, just resting. A signboard hung there with a message Mason could almost read if his beams had been a little higher. He didn't need to. The cones stepped around the gate, and the chain like a dancer stepping around a crack and kept on, leading him into a 2-lane that felt unfamiliar in the way old roads do, mended, patched, a little narrower, the shoulder crumbling in places where the brush had pressed and won. He dropped another 3 miles per hour and settled his hands on the wheel in a way that always made him think of steadying a ladder. The CB hissed and then spoke in his voice. "It's clear," it said. Calm, routine, not quite an echo, not a recording. It was the cadence he used when he left a voicemail for dispatch. The way he clipped the last word without meaning to. The cab felt suddenly too small. Mason glanced at the radio, at the tiny wavering needle, at the cheap green numerals of the channel. He put the mic back in its cradle, even though he couldn't remember lifting it. Half a mile later, the message board appeared again, alone on the shoulder, propped on its little pair of wheels. Its face was blank. Then amber dots woke up and arranged themselves in letters. "Thank you for your cooperation." Mason's skin went cool. A second line winked into being. "Proceed to highlighted route." That phrasing hit him wrong. Highlighted where? There was no GPS overlay on a sign. He eased by and watched it shrink in the mirror until only the glow was left, like a coal. The cones curved one more time and brought him into a bigger space, a sort of wide turnout paved with old asphalt. Lines of paint showed faintly where angled parking used to be. At the far end sat a small building shaped like a kiosk, square and tidy, windows on all sides. The kind of place a ranger might sit in, handing out maps. The door was closed. There was a stool inside. A paper calendar hung on the back wall, and though Mason couldn't see the month, he could see the year. The top corner offered a number that wasn't this year and hadn't been for a while. He could read his own heartbeat in his throat. Outside, the cones formed a spiral. That was the only way to describe it. It was wide, lazy, drawn by someone with patience circling, then circling smaller, curling toward the kiosk. The spiral left a single gap where a semi could nose through, as if it were an invitation. The arrow board sat to one side. It was off. Around him, the desert felt like the inside of a seashell held to the ear. Sound pressed close, oddly curved. He parked a dozen yards from the spiral and set his brake. The truck ticked as heat bled from metal. The sky above the black horizon was dull and star-punched. He switched off his headlights and let the night settle. The cones kept their color even in the dark. That bothered him too. He had thought orange would become gray. He had thought everything would. Mason rolled down his window. A thin breath of warm air came in, carrying the dry, metallic scent of old paint and thorn bushes. A cricket spoke briefly and then stopped, like someone testing if the line was live. He waited. The CB kept its soft hiss. He could hear the faintest whir from the message board's cooling fan. He turned on the dome light, reached into the cubby for his flashlight, and on a quiet impulse, took a sticky note from his logbook and pressed it to the dash. He printed the time, the mile marker from the last one he remembered, and the word spiral. It felt silly. It also felt like a tether. Out on the ground, the night expanded. His boots cut small crunches into the crust of sand where the asphalt had given way at the edges. Up close, the cones were cleaner still. No scuffs, no dust ring at their base, no bugs collected inside the hollow. He suspected if he tapped one, it would ring like new plastic. He didn't. He walked the outer loop, turned at the gap, and stopped. The kiosk window faced him. Inside, the stool moved slightly, as if the air had finally caught up with some old current and nudged it. He lifted his beam. The calendar said a year that meant the highway he'd been on had not yet been widened. It meant he had been hauling different freight. He breathed once, slowly, and the paper didn't move again. When he turned to go back to the cab, the cones seemed to have shifted a hair. Not moved. Really more like their combined presence had leaned, as if they were listening. That was nothing. That was nerves. He cut back through the opening, climbed up, closed the door, and sat with his hands quiet on the wheel for 30 seconds. Then he did what he knew he had to do. He turned the wheel toward the open desert, away from the spiral, and eased around the edge of the paved area to the far side, where the cones didn't go. The truck protested softly as the front tire climbed over a broken lip. He stopped long enough to feel whether any part of him wanted to turn back and honor the orange path laid out like a suggestion that had learned the shape of a command. He kept going. The frontage road found him again like a friend meeting at a corner. He rolled onto it and felt the simple relief of familiar lines under his tires. The CB breathed, and for a moment, something inside the static clicked, like a tongue against teeth, and then went still. Mason didn't say anything. He settled back into the seat and inched his speed up to where it had been before he'd left the highway. The dark looked the way dark ought to look again, complete where his beams weren't, and full of small, honest sounds. The ramp back to the interstate had no cones at its foot. The arrow board in the median was gone. The highway took him up like it always did, steady and broad, and the first mile marker he saw had the same number as the last one he'd written on the note, as if the miles between had never settled their argument with the clock. He reached over, pressed the sticky note down harder with his thumb, and left it. 30 miles later, in a gas station that had never quite settled on being a truck stop but did a good job of pretending, he parked under sodium lamps that turned everything pale and took his thermos inside. The woman at the counter refilled it and slid it back with a practiced wrist flick, and when he asked if she'd heard about a detour out by the old rest area, she frowned politely and said no, they hadn't had crews out there in months. She watched him over the rim of her glasses and said, "You look like you got turned around." He smiled because that was easier than explaining. On the TV above the coffee pots, a local news anchor described wind expected to pick up after dawn. No mention of a closure. No mention of anything but weather and a feature about a farmer's market. He went back out. The truck waited under the buzz, ghosts of moths tapping the light cover. He climbed in and pulled up the dash cam. Curiosity a tide he couldn't hold back. The footage showed the highway, the ramp, the frontage road. It showed cones. It did. But where the spiral should have been was just an emptiness in the video. The truck's beams reaching out to touch flat asphalt, and then a stand of brush. In the corner of the frame, for 4 seconds, something amber flickered where the message board ought to be. And in those 4 seconds, the audio recorded a soft, unhurried voice that sounded like a good imitation of his own say, "Proceed." Then the screen brightened as he turned, and the emptiness ended, and the road was just a road again. He sat for a long moment and listened to the thin pinging of the exhaust as it cooled, the way metal tells itself its own old story. Somewhere, a train sounded 3 notes. They drifted across the flats and faded. He put the truck in gear and rolled back onto the pavement. In the days that followed, when that run came up again, Mason took the route in daylight and found the rest area exactly where it should be, closed for repairs, a paper notice taped to the window with dates for next month. He walked the turnaround where he remembered the spiral had been. There were no marks of cones on the dust. He followed a faint path to the kiosk and stood looking through the glass at the stool and the calendar. It said this year, this month, this day. The air inside didn't stir. He went back to his truck and sat a while. The sticky note was still on the dash. The ink faded slightly from the sundae. He left it there. He didn't need it to remember, but he liked the idea of the small square of yellow keeping its corner in his field of view while the miles unwound. If he heard the CB breathe on clear nights now, he let it. He didn't answer. He didn't take detours that didn't appear anywhere but in the glow of something that could turn its letters on and off at will. You could say he avoided the cones after midnight when the wind dropped and the desert listened. But on evenings when the air turned warm and still and the sky seemed to hold its breath, he'd catch himself glancing toward the median for the amber flicker of a sign. Old habits hold. And now and then, he'd imagine a pair of hands somewhere, sorting new cones from old, placing them in careful gleaming arcs on a stretch of old road that no longer figured in the official maps, asking nothing more difficult than for someone to follow the neatness to its soft, silent center. In his log, written small at the bottom of a page where no one would think to read, he wrote 2 words and underlined them. No spiral. A reminder more than a rule. But rules and reminders sometimes keep a person from stepping into a loop that doesn't belong to them. The highway favors those who let the miles be simple, who see an arrow and also see the sky beyond it. The simple way is often the safe way. He never learned who put the cones out there. He never learned what the message board was trying to help or hinder. He drove on, and somewhere behind him, in a place that was there and wasn't, the kiosk sat, and the stool didn't turn again. Story number 2. Rhea ran the northern plains the way some people tend gardens patiently, with a sense for weather and a respect for boundaries you couldn't see but felt all the same. Her rig was quiet for its size, a late-model sleeper whose engine kept the road like a promise. The trailer behind her hummed with the constant low thrum of refrigeration. That sound was part heartbeat, part lullaby. She called it the ocean in the box. It was a high, clean night. Far-off pump jacks bowed to the darkness like headwaiters. A train threaded the horizon and stitched it with 3 low notes before slipping its sound back into the cold. On either side of the 2-lane, fences ran like the straightest handwriting anyone ever managed, wire humming softly where the wind tested it, fence posts capped with white frost that caught her high beams and glowed for a moment, then folded away. No trees, no towns, just distances doing what distances do. She liked these miles because they were honest. There were no exits to second guess, no jagged city lights that looked closer than they were. There was sky, and there was road, and the gauges lined up just so, and if she kept the reefer at the right set point and the cruise a hair under the limit, she could feel the work settle into her bones with no sharp edges. South of Bowman, the AM band reached out like it always did on cold nights. She didn't use AM for much weather bands. Talk radio when the hum started to feel like a lull, just a flick through the dial to see who else was awake. In the thin air above the pavement, the signal carried and carried. Voices came from far fields and cities she had never once driven to. It was company without conversation. She turned the knob and let the stations flicker past in little slices of other people's lives. A song from before she learned to back a trailer, a late-night call-in show about dreams that always seemed to have the same callers, a sermon with an anchor gentle enough to be a grandfather. The wind laid down for a mile and stood back up. The stars felt close enough to reach. She had a thermos within reach, but no interest in getting jittery. There was no need. The cold did most of the waking for her. The dash threw a soft, even glow around the cab. The little LED on the reefer controller stayed green. Everything was as it should be. Then the green appeared where it shouldn't. At first, Rhea thought it was a glow off a road sign far ahead, some odd reflection from a billboard with the right shade of paint. It blinked once, twice, a thread's thickness above the shoulder. A minute later, there it was again, and closer, and then it wasn't a glow at all but a tiny disk of green light, like a reflector, low and eager, turned exactly toward her lenses. It was strange because out here white was what flashed back at you, and amber when it meant to be helpful, and red only at the ends of things. Green was a town light, a pharmacy sign, the message from a traffic light you only ever saw in places where 2 roads eye each other and nod. Green wasn't for fences. Green wasn't for the long parts. She watched 3, then 4, then a tidy run of them step in from the shoulder, each the same height, each at exactly the right spacing to feel like design and not accident. The path they suggested didn't leave the roadway. It braided itself along the white line and then slipped back out to the shoulder where the rumble strip would speak if she drifted. The discs never moved until she approached, and then they returned the brightness of her beams with the exact, measured tone of something made to do so. She could have reached down and turned the radio knob, and she did, because a habit of checking one odd thing by checking another had served her well. The AM band caught a station so clean, it was as if it were broadcasting from the back seat. A low, official voice spoke without hurry. Northbound units, maintain 5 to 1. Maintain 5 to 1. Repeat, maintain 5 to 1. Safety corridor is active. No passing, no stopping. Green markers indicate alignment. The voice was clear, not computer, not tape. It had a thickness and warmth to it, like a person who had sat in a small room with a good microphone and had done this kind of work for years. It never said a station identifier. It never mentioned a highway number. It didn't have to. It spoke in a way that slid into the space between thought and action, and lived there like it belonged. Rhea eased a foot off the pedal just enough to feel whether the truck wanted to argue, and then eased it back. The speed settled at 51, as smoothly as if the cruise had decided for her. She told herself it was a winter operations test, some new visibility project rolled out in a district where the snow drifts could hide a road in 10 minutes flat. She'd seen new ideas before. She'd driven through those stretches where they'd set up taller, brighter reflectors so when the ground turned into a white sheet you still had a clue. It was smart work. It saved people. Maybe this was that. It felt like maybe. The green points taught her eyes to expect them. She watched the rhythm right, left, left, right, right, and the road itself seemed to grow into that cadence. Her shoulders let down a notch she hadn't known they were carrying. The reefer's hum felt steadier. A coyote loped down a cut and away, and when her lights touched it, the animal looked back without fear or hurry, eyes briefly turning a warm coin color before it went soft again and was gone. The radio whispered, "Maintain 5 to 1, and it was not a command. It was a suggestion that had learned the same shape as that word. She felt a slight pressure in her ear, as if the pressure in the cab were adjusting very slowly. The green discs pulled just a little inward, as if the road had narrowed by a foot without changing anything. She drove within that measure and found it pleasant, like wearing a jacket tailored to fit a little snug at the shoulders. Far ahead, 2 taillights appeared, faint as fireflies and then steadier, a matched pair, the kind you could follow without thinking. Rhea liked a rabbit at night, another driver to set the pace, to warn of dips and elk and troopers. She closed on the lights and then did not close. They set themselves at a perfect, respectful distance, and she held there without effort. The shape between those lights was old-fashioned. A short, boxy trailer, maybe 30 feet, maybe less. The cab ahead had that squared-off posture of a cab-over from back when companies were strict about overall length. The silhouette was clean and dark, as if someone had drawn it carefully to teach children the concept of a truck. No hood marker lights, no company logo that her beams could find. Just a plain, upright box and a driver who kept a line like it was held with a string. The radio said, "No passing, no stopping. Maintain 5 to 1. Okay, Rhea thought. They were running a convoy test. 2-lane, at night, through the flats. Maybe they were mapping how wind drift formed around big vehicles and wanted hard data with live traffic. She could allow curiosity to soften like that and feel safe. She let herself think about coffee for a moment, about the taste of something from a store with bright light and a countertop the color of wet sugar. The thought warmed her for a mile, and then fell away like a coat that had slipped off the back of a chair. It didn't matter. The green points curved slightly to follow a broad, even bend, and the taillights ahead traced that shape with a delicacy that made her feel she ought not breathe too loud in case she jostled that line. A mile marker slipped past. 68. A minute later, 68 again. She blinked. Maybe she had caught an older marker that hadn't been removed. That happened. Maybe the frost caught the paint differently. The radio made a crisp, tiny click, and then continued. Maintain 5 to 1. Maintain alignment. Keep center space clear. She moved her hands on the wheel and felt the leather under her fingers like it was new. She had put that cover on herself last year in a parking lot, in the warm quiet between storms. She had worked the seam tight. The seam was here, under her left thumb. Familiar. Real. She checked her phone map without taking her eyes off the road for more than a breath. The blue line went straight. The GPS dot crept like it should. Nothing about the screen commented on green reflectors or a convoy. It never would. One more green disc winked, and then the next in its place. And she felt the gentle invitation in that rhythm to let whatever else she had in her mind fall into step. "No passing," said the voice, mild as a librarian. "No stopping. Maintain 5 to 1. The taillights ahead did a thing then that made the hair at the back of her neck learn a new sentence. They flickered in a pattern she knew from the city, 3 quick taps of the brakes, as if saying thanks at a ramp, and there was no ramp. And there had been no courtesy. The signal was to her. The signal said, "You're with us." She let her eyes drift to the far right, to the fence, to the ground. The green points had replaced the little reflector tabs on the post tops. She hadn't noticed when. Posts that should have been dull with frost wore bright green, and the wire between them had no frost at all now. No white, no whisper. Her beam made a finger in the air, and the air felt thicker where it touched. Rhea turned down the AM one notch. It didn't change the voice's closeness. "Maintain," it said. Pleasant as advice about sweaters. "Maintain." She pressed the window switch and cracked the glass. Cold came in like a friend who had been expected. The taste of it steadied her. With the window down a finger's width, she could hear the tires better. The song they made on the pavement told her what the surface was doing. The pitch was exactly what it should have been for this speed on a road like this. What the tires told her was correct. It was a good song. The reefer's hum, though, seemed to have buried an extra note inside itself, an overtone she hadn't heard earlier. She could feel it in her back teeth. She didn't like that. That was new. She thought about stopping to check the unit, to walk back and listen, to put a hand on the aluminum and feel the way the cold sat in it like water in a bowl. But the voice, "no stopping," said it in such an easy way that it didn't feel like a rule. It felt like a description of what people in the know did as a matter of course. She reached to the radio and pushed the AM button. The display stayed the same. The knob under her fingers felt like a coin stuck in a crack. She pressed again, and the sound didn't move. She pressed the power entirely off, and in the humming dark of the cab, the voice continued without having to go through the speaker at all. "Maintain, maintain." Rhea smiled then, a short, dry thing that had nothing to do with humor. She touched the metal loop she kept hung from the dash, a key ring with an old motel tag her grandfather had carried in his pocket for decades until it became as smooth as a shell. She had no superstition about it, and also wouldn't have left it behind for anything. She slid it once on the string where it hung, and the little tack sound it made was exactly the sound it always made. Good. The world allowed friction. The taillights ahead gave a slow signal left, and then right, as if changing lanes. There was only one lane. The green discs floated a hair to the left, and the grand empty to the right came up and leaned close like a window about to be opened. The line that had kept the edge where the road fell to gravel, and then to ditch, seemed to lower itself, not disappear. Just step down like a person ducking their head under a doorway. Rhea could no longer tell, in that careful fraction, where asphalt ended and shoulder began. Her father had taught her a trick for nights like this years ago, when she shadowed him in a rental car, following the shape his taillights made, as if they were a promise that would hold even a new driver upright. "If you think the road is changing when it shouldn't," he said, "look for the things nobody can fake on the fly. Cattle guards, culverts, the way the snow piles where the wind has always liked to stop. Look for the real metal. Find a sound the road can't duplicate." Rhea let the distance to the taillights lengthen by a second. The green discs didn't like that. They tightened their rhythm under her beams, as if anxious she might stray. The voice came as soft as a blanket. "Maintain. Maintain 5 to 1. To the right, set back from the fence line, a pair of cottonwoods stood dark and spare, the chalk of their trunks luminous. Between them lay a narrow ranch approach. 2 ribbons of frost-silvered dirt leading to a cattle guard with its grip of pipes set in a rectangle of concrete. That rectangle would sound, no matter what the rest of this wanted. It would sound. Rhea clicked on her hazards. 2 slow, steady pulses, an old-fashioned courtesy that would give anyone behind her fair warning. The taillights ahead did not change. She eased right as gently as a person tucking hair behind. An ear, and the green discs slid to follow, their attention avid. She moved another inch. The discs crowded the edge. She made the decision the way she always made decisions that mattered, in the space of one full breath. In. She set the wheel as if it had weight she could actually feel in her hands and steered for the cottonwoods. The tires touched gravel. The music under the cab changed. The reefer's hum found its place again, and dropped its buried note, as if a bird had flown out of a room. The front axle rolled onto the cattle guard. The pipes spoke a clean, ringing tune up through the frame that had nothing to do with illusions. She felt it in her bones the way she'd hoped she would. She let the truck idle forward until the whole of her was off the highway and held there, parked at an angle that would make it easy, in a minute, to roll back on if the world allowed. The green discs stopped at the mouth of the ranch approach. They did not follow. They hung there until her beams left them, and then went dark at once, like eyes deciding to close. The AM voice in the silent radio said, "Maintain," and the word had to climb to reach her now. The taillights ahead, those 2 kind, patient dots slid on without her, and then were simply not there. She turned on the cab light. The small circle of warm illumination changed the scale of the night, in a way that made her feel able to think again. Outside, a cold, light wind moved the cottonwood branches with a murmuring like low water. Somewhere in the wide pasture, a cow shifted, its weight making a soft thud she could feel more than hear. The sky held nothing but stars and the faintest vapor where her breath had condensed and drifted. The reefer kept to its work. The gauges held. She sat and counted out her breath until each one felt like it got to put its feet on the ground. Rhea climbed down and walked the front of the truck with her light pointed low, boots crunching on cold gravel. The surround of the night was deep and kind. She checked the tires with the back of her fingers and the edge of her knuckle, felt their warmth like a dog's belly after sleep. She looked along the trailer and listened for the wrong vibration, and heard none. The cattle guard sat mute and sensible now, its earlier scale run spent. She held her light toward the highway just enough to see the surface. It lay there like a ribbon set on a dark table, and there were no green discs at all. A moment later, as if thinking better of it, a faint green at the edge winked once, then went to sleep. She got back in, closed the door, and the cab carried her weight the way an old friend does. The AM dial was still off. It didn't matter. The idea of the voice moved back a room in the house of her mind. She set the wheel straight and eased back toward the highway. When the front tires touched asphalt, nothing argued. She merged with no one, accelerated to the speed the law liked to see, and felt every part of the truck take that new balance. 10 miles later, a proper truck stop rolled up out of the flat like a small city. The kind with tall lights and a few darkened semis already in for the night, each breathing its own small cloud. The store was warm in the way only a night store can be. A high school game was on a muted TV mounted above an aisle of bright chips. Two drivers in caps with salt on their shoulders stood by the fountain drinks, discussing chain laws as if they were recipes. Rhea filled her thermos and added just enough sugar to take the edge off. At the register, a kid with a name tag that said KYLE took her cash and said, "Watch for ice on the overpass 12 miles north. They had a water truck leak earlier." She thanked him and asked if he knew a station that ran a late-night highway advisory with a voice like a county clerk. He blinked and said the weather band came in best on 8s. She smiled and changed the subject to pastries. He told her the apple fritter was made in town. She bought it and took a bite big enough to make the world a little simpler. Back out under the tall lamps, a driver about the age Rhea thought of as still a decade away for herself was tightening a bungee on his load of pipe. He nodded the way drivers do to strangers they'll never see again and said, "You see the green cats tonight?" He said it as if testing whether a new coin would pass for currency. Rhea felt the reefer hum step down against her back. "Maybe," she said. The man smiled without showing teeth. "They do that sometimes out there," he said, vaguely waving the wrench at the dark. "Folks call it the ribbon." My uncle said it started when they took out the old beacons on the airmail route, and the ground didn't like being ignored. He said the cold lays down in the draws and radio runs over it like water on glass. He says that's nonsense, but he says it anyway. He tossed the bungee, caught it without looking, and hooked it tight. "Anybody asks, the state'll tell you they never used green. That's how I remember what to do. If it's green, I ain't in it." "Good rule," Rhea said. He shrugged. "World loves a line. World loves folks who stay in one." He gave her a little salute with the wrench and went back to his squared, methodical work. Rhea climbed back into the truck. The bunk looked like a reasonable promise. She killed the cab light and let the yard's glow fall through the windshield like distant weather. The reefer sang, and the engine ticked as heat moved from where it had been needed to where it would keep. She did not turn the radio back on. She brushed a hand across the part of the dash where the AM button lived and felt the plastic of it like she was touching an old scar. Sleep, when it came like a slow tide. In that soft drift she dreamt in motion, not fast, just steady, and the line at the edge of her beam was not green but a paler, kinder white that knew its work and did it simply. When she woke, there was a soft seam of color at the far lip of the world, a pre-dawn wash so faint it was more an idea of light than light itself. She sat up, stretched, and the truck made the small noises trucks make when someone brings them back from the place machines go when they are allowed to rest. She rolled out into a morning that made the fields shine with a thin glass of frost. Every reflector along the fence was its old, familiar, sleepy white. The horizon wore a long, low line of cloud that would later think about snow but hadn't made up its mind yet. 20 miles north, the overpass was slick, where Kyle had said it would be, a matte dark that told the truth. She eased over it with respect and moved on. Later, in a diner that had a row of mugs above the coffee machine like trophies and the sort of pancakes that would carry a person through a week, she unfolded her paper map, the one with the creases she could read, like old notes, and put a small pencil dot on a space where the roads on the page made nothing but a straight line. Not an X, not a warning, just a dot to say, pay attention here. The world is good and it is wide. And sometimes it tests to see if you'll let it have both those things at once. The next time the cold made the AM band reach, she left it be. She drove with the thin whistle at the edge of the door seal, and the reefer's faithful song, and the quiet, sensible arithmetic of the mile markers. When she passed the place with the cottonwoods and the cattle guard, she let her eyes slide right just far enough to see the rectangle of concrete where it always had been. It sat there, not saying anything, ready if someone needed proof the road belonged to the ground, and not the other way around. And sometimes, on nights when the sky was clear enough to see all the stories it had ever told in pinpoints of light, she would think of the two taillights ahead that had wanted her for company, and wonder how long a line could run if no one ever broke it. Then she'd check her mirror, set her hands again, and do the simplest, safest thing most people ever do. She drove on. Story number 3. Inez hauled produce down the coast at night because the air was kind, then cool, salt-sweet, and steady. The refrigerated trailer behind her brushed its soft, constant tone across the cab, and the sound reminded her of tide pulling through pilings. The road ran low and faithful between stretches of marsh and open water, causeway after causeway, like beads on a string. Shrimp boats slept on their moorings with deck lights turned to dim. Far out, a bell buoy marked a channel with a patient clang that didn't so much ring as breathe. Fog came in shy at first, lying along the water like a sheet someone had drawn up to a chin. The wipers tapped their metronome only when she told them to, long pauses between. The shoulders were narrow here. She liked narrow shoulders, they made everyone honest. You couldn't pretend you had space you didn't. The road's white edge wore a thin gloss from the mist. Every reflector ahead returned her light a little differently. Some fat with droplets, and some scoured clean by wind that came and went in the way wind does. On its own time, the drawbridge towers rose before she could see them. Two simple shapes in the fog, darker than everything else, with a red light hung near the top of each like a thoughtful ornament. The grading section made a different music under a truck's weight, a bright, thrumming hum. She had driven that bridge enough times to know when the sound would start and how long it would last, to the second, if she hit it at a steady 45. She knew this road so well, she kept a folded tide chart in her visor as a kindness to herself. And she glanced at it as she passed a mile marker on the approach. The tide was coming in, a medium tide, enough to fill the marsh cuts until they were black lengths of mirror. In the cab, the air smelled faintly of oranges, and that comforted her. A man somewhere upstate would open his back door in the morning and take a breath, and it would be oranges. She liked hauling things that improved a day. The first ring came from the right. The sound was modest, bell-like in a domestic way, not a horn, not a siren, the kind of tone a person once heard from a wall-mounted telephone in a hallway. She looked toward the shoulder expecting to catch the wink of a fishing alarm bell, but saw only the slender post of an emergency call box sitting at the far end of a short pull-off. A metal cabinet, square against the fog. A small round speaker above a weathered button. She had watched those posts lose their purpose over the last few years, replaced by mile marker numbers and apps, and the assumption that everyone could summon help with a thumb and a blue dot. The call box rang again, clean and bright, as though the metal had not lived outside for a single day. She reached to turn down the radio, just a music station fading out of town, and listened, waiting for the sound to falter the way old metal does. It didn't. It sounded new and patient, like a room waiting to be occupied. The ring fell behind as she rolled past the pull-off. 50 yards ahead, another call box sat in its place by the rail. And that one rang too. The timing was precise. As her front wheels reached the level of each post, a gentle chime tripped, as if the road itself were stepping on a series of pressure plates. She watched her speed creep from 50 to 49, and found her foot steady again. She kept her lane as if the whole causeway might have been a long hallway with doors numbered and waiting. By the fourth ring, she told herself a simple story, because simple stories had saved her attention more than once. Some maintenance crew had set a test mode, or a sensor had picked up something harmless, and was doing what sensors do when they sense. She nodded at her own thought, and rolled her shoulders once to shake out the scrim of nerves the fog liked to lay over shoulders. Between the third and fourth posts, the fog drew one breath deeper. The world became smaller in a soft, agreeable way, as if the road had pulled up the blanket another inch, leaving the cab a warm bubble. The towers ahead were only suggestions now, their red lights a pair of embers in gauze. The bell buoy out in the channel measured its interval, a sound like a slow heartbeat. Inez matched her own breath to that polite clang, and found herself calmer for having obeyed something that didn't need her at all. Another ring. It sounded this time inside the door panel, as if the sound had been woven through the truck and not pushed at it from outside. She checked the mirrors as if the ringing might have left a trail. The right side glass held a picture of fog that returned the same answer. Fog always returns itself. Left side mirror. More of the same. The trailer lights made two even rubies in the mist behind her, and didn't flicker. The reefer kept on. She tapped the brakes lightly to wipe any damp off the drums. The light pressure steadied her hands. The drawbridge gates came into view like teeth on a zipper, down across both lanes, receding into the fog. Red lamps dotted the arms. The grating language under the cab changed a watt, and then quieted as she rolled to an easy, safe stop at the bar. The call box nearest the gate chimed its sweet, archaic ring, and held it a fraction longer than the others had. Inez set her brake and watched the gate for that small shiver of movement that meant a tender up in the tower had heard a bell. She could not. The red light said, "Wait." Waiting had never hurt her. She took the moment to check her gauges. Everything lay where it belonged. The oranges slept in their cool box. The fog curled over the rail like something benign settling in to hear a story. She turned off the wipers and let the droplets gather. The call box on the post a dozen feet away broke its pattern and spoke, not in words but in a new tone. One long, low note, like a throat clearing. It made a second sound then, a clean, almost crisp click, and she knew that click from old movies and old houses and grandparents' kitchens. The lifting of a receiver, the joining of a circuit. Her window was already cracked for the fresh air. Without quite deciding, she pushed the switch and let it drop another inch. The damp came in and brought with it a scent of rope and iron and river mud. She waited because the word hello had lodged in her throat and refused to step out. The call box decided for her. "Number, please," a woman's voice said, bright and practiced, enunciating each syllable with a smile. It was not unkind. It was an old sound. Older than the posts. Older than the new bridge. Older maybe than the steel that had made the first one. Inez did not reach for the call box button. As an experiment, she spoke into the fog itself, soft and even. "You have a truck at the east gate." A small pause followed, the kind of pause a human makes when turning to find a pencil. "Truck at the east gate," the voice repeated, perfectly pleased. Something moved in the fog against the rail, too low to be a person and too purposeful to be nothing. It was a shape like a cable pulled slowly, skimming the rail, down the line. "You need the tender," Inez said, still soft. She had no idea why she was pretending to be part of this arrangement. "You need the bridge." "The bridge," the voice said, and then it wasn't a voice. It was a washing click and an open, breathy sound, the sort of hush a line makes when someone on the other end is either gone or listening so hard, the listening itself becomes a sound. A white arrow winked alive on the gate's arm to her right, pointing toward the shoulder where fishermen usually tucked their pickups on clear mornings. Then, ahead, low and to the side, another arrow glowed on the fog, not on a sign, not on plastic, just inscribed on the air like a reflection from something that wasn't there to reflect. It drifted a few feet and steadied, pointing to a narrow service lane separated from the travel lane by a painted line and a low curb. That service lane ran along the outside of the bridge, just enough space for a maintenance truck to creep. Just enough, not for a full-size rig. She knew that. Inez had watched men in yellow vests drive there for inspections, slow and careful, with hazard lights ticking loud in the morning Sunday. The arrow hung in the fog all the same, lit from some clever angle. The red lamp on the gate arm stared into her windshield like a held breath. The bell buoy out on the water took its time and found its voice again. The radio crackled in that decorous way equipment does when it wants attention, and also wants to pretend it doesn't. A clean, official voice stepped into the cab as if invited. "Lane 3 open for through traffic," it said. "Lane 3, proceed now. No delay." There were only 2 lanes. Inez looked at the stenciled numerals on the pavement just beyond the gate, 1 and 2. She breathed once and let the number settle in her mind, like a coin in a jar. She checked her habit, the one that kept a finger on a simple truth when something complicated tried to lay on top of it. The grating. When the bridge closed, traffic rolled over the grating. When it opened, the grating didn't sing because it didn't exist. It stood somewhere out over black water doing its other job. She opened her window another inch, until the fog made itself at home in the cab, the way a cat will claim a patch of Sunday. She listened for metal making, the song metal makes when it is whole. Beyond the gate, she heard only the quiet, watery hush of current combing through pilings. Lower, down under the road where her truck didn't live, she caught a tiny whine. A motor, in no hurry. "Lane 3, the voice said again, patient. She flicked on her hazard lights. Their amber rhythm felt like a hand on her shoulder. Here, here, here. The fog caught the pulses and turned each one into a room of its own, and then let it go. In that interval she saw better, not farther but better. There is a difference. In the nearest amber blink, the arrow in the fog didn't exist at all. In the next, it was as bright as a clean stencil. In the next, it was gone again. She watched the pattern for 3 full cycles and let the pattern fail to be a pattern. The call box, polite as ever, made a single questioning ring. 2 faint beams glided under the bridge, a boat, moving slow as respect. The light swept in a neat line and made small diamonds on the damp underside of the deck. The beam lifted and flirted with the fog itself and drew a simple cross 1, 2, 3 times. That wasn't a signal she had learned in any formal way, but her bones knew a body language when they saw one. Wait. The radio, perhaps realizing it had lost the room, went quiet. The white arrow in the air turned the brightness it couldn't hold into a modest glow, then into nothing. Somewhere above, something heavy found its seat with a mild, satisfied thud. The red lamps on the gate arms blinked twice and then burned steady. The arms lifted with a grace that always surprised her. When she thought about the weight they had to remember how to carry. Past the gates, the fog retained its shape for a moment like memory, then let it change. The grating track received the first faint tick of water sloughing out of it. A moment after that, the fine, bright hum of metal under load sang under her front axle. There was no mistaking it. A sound like that had no ghost version. Inez eased her foot back onto the pedal and moved across. The fog kept close. The hum ran the length of the cab floor with a tenderness that made her smile despite herself. Halfway over, curiosity, that companion that never does learn caution but is always welcome anyway, tugged at her. She let her eyes slide to the right. Where the pale arrow had pointed there was no lane at all, only a short square of concrete poured as a platform around a maintenance ladder, then air, then black water polished in a strip by the current. A row of old timber pilings stood beyond like a sentence of lowercase L's typed too quickly. The service curb and painted line resumed on the far side of a gap so clean and matter-of-fact it didn't seem capable of pretending to be anything else. On the opposite bank, the causeway sat quiet, one thin line through the marshland. The call box over there did not ring. It stood like a post stands when it has learned how to be a post and asks nothing more. Half a mile off the bridge, the fog thinned. The world became bigger again without showing off. The bell buoy lost itself in the small clatter of insects that woke even in damp. A new sign had been bolted up near a turnout, brown and modest. Former bridge alignment. A second sign held a few lines about a bridge from a different year, a dedication, a date of removal, a note about birds who preferred the old pilings, and so the old pilings had been left for them. The board included a black and white photograph of a lady in gloves cutting a ribbon, and, along the rail in the picture, 3 call boxes that looked new and proud. At the next wide place to pull off, Inez parked under a light that wore a lace collar of moths. She poured a small cup of coffee from her thermos and let her hands close around the heat. A pelican drifted along the marsh edge like an idea someone hadn't committed to. The drawbridge towers were gone in the fog behind her. In their place, a glowing suggestion of height. She could still feel the thin buzz of grating under her feet from a few minutes ago, the way some sounds take up residence and pay rent for a while. On the inside wall of the store beside the fuel desk, there was a corkboard with business cards and notes from boat captains seeking deckhands and deckhands seeking boats. A laminated flyer showed a little map of the drawbridge and cautioned motorists not to enter the service lanes except by order of a crew on site. It added, helpfully, that the emergency telephones on the causeway were no longer monitored. Someone had underlined that sentence with a black pen hard enough to leave dents. The woman at the counter had the agreeable tired of a person whose night shift had been quiet. Inez asked if the draw still took calls by phone when the weather turned. The woman smiled at her own memory and said the tender kept a VHF radio and the usual equipment. But sometimes the fog made the sound pulse funny, and sometimes folks heard what they expected to hear. My granddad used to say the river gets everything eventually, she added. Sounds, too. Inez nodded like that was the end of it, and went back to her rig. The Oranges didn't care about bridges or old boxes or the way fog teaches a person to trust simple tests. They cared about time and temperature. She checked both, and found them friendly. Before she pulled out, she took the tide chart from her visor and copied the morning's tide height into a small notebook she kept for markers that mattered only to her. Beneath it, she wrote 6 words and drew a small square by habit, as if the square could hold them in place. Wait for the grating to sing. She took the next stretch at a pace that pleased the road. The fog thinned and then braided itself into flats, where shorebirds picked methodically in water only as deep as their own reflections. A heron lifted and unfolded and became a piece of sky. The call boxes along the rail stood like punctuation marks in a sentence about a time when talking to a person far away required a wire that needed tending. Before dawn, a pink she wouldn't have called pink if she'd had any other word for it brushed the underside of the clouds. The bell buoy became a dark shape again, not just a sound, and the far lights of a town put a few polite coins of brightness out on the water, as if to pay the night for its work. Inez watched the line through her windshield and kept her hands easy on the wheel. The reefer traced its gentle hymn. When her radio found the first real station of the morning, it was an old song about a road that didn't make any promises, and that felt right. Much later, with the fog gone and the world sorted into clear lines again, she saw a small, square building off a quiet exit, a historical society with a flag, and a hand-lettered open sign. If she had been off the clock, she might have stopped and looked to see if they kept in a drawer a photograph of someone once standing by a brand new emergency call box, looking pleased with how a road had learned to speak to help. Another night, perhaps. For now, she kept the ocean at her right shoulder and the work at her hands and drove, remembering the mild ring of a tone that had asked nothing in particular of her except to say she was there. On other runs, when fog pooled and the causeways turned soft-edged and kind again, the call boxes would sometimes keep their silence, and sometimes they would ring as she passed, each one for the span of her truck's length. No more, no less. She didn't answer them. She didn't mind them either. A road remembers what it was. A driver does too. The best nights, the hum of the grating came exactly when it should, and everything that wanted to pretend to be a lane or a voice let itself be only fog and night, and a sound carried through the work of water. Story number 4. Deshaun took the night miles through the spine of the mountains because they felt like a conversation he knew how to have. The ridges rose dark as sleeping shoulders, and the road threaded the gaps with switchbacks the engineers had softened into long, polite curves. Beside the lanes, black-limbed maples clattered their last leaves. The creek below the grade stitched a bright, constant sound under everything, a silver zipper that never caught. He kept his engine brake to himself out of courtesy. In towns tucked close to the highway, he let gravity have its say quietly. Out there, quiet felt like respect. His rig was a steady mid-decade tractor with a deep, even idle, the kind of note you can lean a thought against. Behind him, coils of steel rode low and secure, cradled like sleeping dogs, strapped and rechecked twice since sunset. He liked hauling weight that told the truth. Coils did that. They sat low and insisted you remember momentum existed. On the eastern sky's hard rim, a faint smear of cold stars kept their distance. He rolled past a stand of rock, where netting was stretched like a giant's lace to keep the hillside's small thoughts from becoming the highway's problems. Then another, the mesh making a soft hiss in the wind like a crowd being reminded to be patient. Signs came in their usual order. Steep grade ahead, next 4 miles. Check brakes. Runaway truck ramp 2 miles. He read them the way a person reads notes they've written to themselves on a morning that will go well if they do what they've already promised to do. At mile marker 112, an overhead message board woke up out of the dark. Its amber letters marched left to right, with the easy authority of official things. Night rockwork. Expect pilot car. Stop when read. Deshaun frowned without meaning to. Dispatch hadn't said a word about rockwork. The last state update he'd glanced at showed nothing but routine. Still, mountain work happened when it could. Knight let crews cut rock without frying. He lifted a finger off the wheel and waggled it once toward the sign, a habit old drivers had taught him like a superstition, noted. The next board agreed with the first. It added a time range and a mile number that made sense. 118.7. Okay, he did the math in his head, the simple subtraction that told him how many minutes of downhill he had between here and a red lamp holding the lane. He nudged the cruise down and let his foot remember its own weight. The steel coils weren't restless. They kept to their cradle like the good friends they were. The air cooled another degree, and then decided to keep to that. In the cab, he could smell cold rock, a mineral clean that felt like biting into an apple. He took a sip of coffee he didn't need, and liked it anyway. The CB murmured, and then went quiet in the way mountain. CB-does voices caught on the wrong side of ridge lines, had nothing to say to each other, and eventually gave up. In the quiet, the world got bigger. He liked that too. Lights bloomed through the trees ahead in pairs at shoulder height. A portable signal set one of those temporary traffic lights on rubber wheels through red across both lanes. Beyond it, the high-vis, rectangles of drums and a line of reflector posts glowed like schoolroom rulers. He eased to a stop as if the idea had started in the axle and worked its way up. The coils pressed the trailer axles into the pavement with the same sensible insistence they always had. He set his brake. His engine settled into a low, agreeable rumble that sounded like an old man humming parts of a hymn he didn't realize he knew. To his left, the mountain kept its counsel. To his right, the drop fell away into brush and the dark shine of the creek. The red lamps watched him with the patient stare of something that was good at one job and proud of it. Then, through the red, came a warm sweep of amber. A pickup with a light bar rolled up from the far side, across the dark, into the circle of his beams. "Follow me" blinked in block letters across its tailgate. Deshaun's mouth did the thing it did when he saw a clever piece of equipment at work, a little nod of appreciation. Follow cars were the mountain's way of telling drivers that their work and the road's work were going to share a lane for a minute and needed a referee. He released his brake and let the pickup pull him into motion, the amber arrow bobbing like a metronome. Behind him, a box truck and a sedan fell in. The small convoy had the neat, polite feel of a line in a cafeteria that had decided to be a parade. The first 100 yards felt like any work zone. The portable signal receded, and drums narrowed his lane a foot or so on the left. The paint stripe on the right wore fresh scuffs where tires had swept away grit. The air changed the way it does when a wall goes up. A little stiller, a little warmer. They passed under a concrete rock shed, one of those stout roofs built over the roadway to catch whatever the hillside might later decide to offer. On the shed's ceiling, his headlights lit up seamed concrete patched years apart. Gravel ticked softly somewhere above like distant beads in a jar being turned in a slow hand. The pickup paced him modestly, never letting the gap grow long enough for doubt. "Follow." Me blinked in a rhythm his eyes learned in 3 cycles, and then ignored. The sign font was a touch off from what he'd normally see on a state rig blockier, as if printed with a brush lettered for a fair, but lots of contractors ran lots of equipment. No reason to judge. His GPS dot slid along the purple ribbon the navigation app laid atop the map. The ribbon had shifted off the 4-lane line without his noticing, hunching onto a thinner road that hugged the same slope like a younger sibling keeping up. Deshaun glanced at that because he paid attention. When the screen told him he wasn't exactly where he thought he was, and because looking down for a heartbeat and back up again felt like a way of shaking a small unease out of his shoulders. The road narrowed another foot. The center line, which had been a crisp double yellow with reflectors set like coins, lost its cat's eyes and became a single, older stripe like it had been pushed through a time a decade to fetch it. The right-hand edge line quit being so bright. The pickup slowed another 3 miles per hour, and the "follow me" message kept its friendly thrum. Beyond the dash, beyond the warm circle of the cab, the night kept being night. A rail that once had held a chain-link fence caught his eye. No fence now, just the bare posts. The air in the work zone carried that faint sweet of cut stone and diesel, and the anesthetic clean of new paint. He breathed in and let the smell be what it was. Rules will save you, one of his mentors had told him the month he got his own truck. Not law's rules. The simple dumb ones no one makes up because the road already found them. On divided highways in this state, amber reflectors faced left to tell you where the median lived, and white faced right to keep you honest. Wrong way reflectors gave you red, yellow on the left, white on the right. It was like knowing where the curb was in the dark by the way your ears knew the sound of your own footfall. He let his eyes flick to the barrier on his left as they eased around a curve. Amber reflectors returned his beam where he expected. Good. On his right, the little degree of nothing the work zone had left him held steady. A portable signboard leaned against the rock with its legs folded, its face dark. If anyone had needed to tell him to stop again, it could have. It didn't. They came to a bend where the old road, because that was what this was now. The old alignment spun around a knuckle of stone. The pickup took it tight. Ahead, a rectangular mouth appeared, blacker than the night around it, edged with stone dark as cake crust. A tunnel, low, short, old, the kind of bore that had been chiseled through for two-lane traffic back when trucks were shorter and men drove with elbows out and a cigarette burning low. This bore wore no clearance placard that his lights could find. The "Follow Me" sign urged them on. Deshaun's scalp prickled in a practical way. His rig would fit by numbers. His brain didn't like unnumbered mouths. He touched the brakes with the lightest feather a foot, enough to get the box truck behind him to take a breath. The pickup ahead slowed in sympathy. On its tailgate, the words seemed to blink faster for a beat. He could smell damp rock now, rich and cool. He could also hear the creak more clearly, as if the tunnel had gathered its sound and served it up. He checked the simplest truth he owned. The reflectors on his left were amber again. Good. The ones on his right, where the wall was raw stone and a rail, were white. Better. He tilted his eye to catch the edge of the tunnel mouth. No reflectors there at all, just the old stone stacked with patient hands. The clearance would likely be fine, likely. The extra antennas on his roof scraped nothing. The pipes up above the cab, too tall to give, felt their own height and said nothing. He slow rolled to the lip so the first inches of his bumper wore the tunnel's black. From inside the tunnel came a brief, bright note. Not a horn, not the metal song of grating. A three-beat human-sounding thing, like a childhood game played on the backs of wooden pews. Tick, tick, tock. It didn't come again. The pickup sign held its blinking encouragement like a smile that had been polite too long. In the glass above his steering wheel, one of the small courtesy mirrors caught the reflection of his own trailer corner, then the stone, then a faint red dot at the roofline of the bore. Red. Not a reflector, an old lamp covered in dust that had decided to glimmer at him like a tired eye. I know you, it seemed to say. I know what you are, and what you were not built for. He thought of the coils, heavy and calm, and the thin margin old tunnels sometimes kept for themselves. He did a small thing he had taught himself to do on nights when a decision had less time about it than he wanted. He took one breath as if putting it in a box, and then made the choice already in his hands. He set his brake. The pickup's hazard bar brightened and dimmed as if it had sighed. The words "Follow Me" flipped off and came back as "Keep moving." The font shifted a whisper. He left his hand on the brake and loosened his grip on nothing. Behind him, the box truck breathed a little patience, no horn, no push, just an understanding that the mountain sometimes asked a man to make his own slow mind up. 30 seconds passed. The creak made no complaint. The truck's cooling fan spun once and stopped. Somewhere above, a pebble ticked the mesh. A single thought the hillside wanted to share. The pickup idled. In the half-circle of his headlamps, the tunnel stones looked like something placed by hands that had gone home a long time ago and lived other lives. The message on the pickup changed once more, not as a blink now, but as if an idea had finally made up its mind. Turn around, it said, tall letters even, with the cheery cruelty of a command that didn't have to care how a man would manage it with 70 feet of truck and 1,000 feet of drop on his right. There was a chain-up turnout just behind, a modest apron carved out of the hill for snow days. Deshawn's brain printed out a diagram in a line and a half. Pull back, nose in, back across, nose through, keep it small. He clicked his hazards on. Amber met the rock, made rooms and let them go. He slipped his rig into reverse and felt the heavy, familiar comfort of his trailer minding him as he backed into the angle. The box truck hung back like a gentleman giving a neighbor the aisle. The sedan sat it out calm, headlights making their own little theater. He used 3 moves, not 4. The last slide brushed so close to the rail on the valley side he could have leaned out and touched it with a stick of gum. He breathed when he was done and had his nose pointed back toward the modern lanes he'd left. The pickup did not follow. It did not turn. It did not correct itself and ask for another go. It idled by the tunnel until he was 100 yards away, and then its lights went off as if someone had remembered a bill. Back at the portable signal, there was no signal. The stand stood there with its legs folded like a foal sleeping. The drums stood where they had stood, but their reflective bands had the mild gray look of old tape that had seen sun and rain and a season too many. The overhead message board at the next curve showed nothing but a power on screen like a calculator turned sideways. He slid back onto the 4-lane, and the world snapped into its present self, again bright lines, generous shoulder, a rumble strip that said the same simple word each time he tested it. Here, a little farther down, a turnout with a view of nothing in the dark, had a historical marker under a light. He did not stop, but his beams found enough of the plaque to catch a phrase. Original alignment, narrow bore, retired in 1998. Another sign pleased some future tourist with the promise of a scenic loop when the gates were open in the day. The gates in the night were shut, with chains like punctuation marks. He made the grade down to the river and rolled across the long bridge with the kind of attention bridges ask and reward. At a truck stop where the mountain had worn itself down into something gentler and left room for diesel pumps, he pulled in under white light, gentled by moths. The building was old brick and had a line of photographs in black and white, showing men standing on rock in hats that turned their faces into dark commas. He brought his thermos inside and ordered chili because the cold had decided to fill the hollows and he wasn't about to argue. The woman behind the counter, hair back, eyes friendly in a way that said she had a family sleeping and would go to them when the clock allowed, poured his coffee and asked where he'd run from. He told her the ridge and the cut and the portable light. Her face made a small fold of thought right between the eyes. The place where a person keeps a shared map. They don't blast at night out there anymore, she said softly. Not since before my boy was born. They finished that whole mess before the dot-coms went sideways. She smiled like she was keeping it light. They used to swing pilot cars on the old road when they had it open weekends, but folks kept taking campers up to the bore and trying to convince themselves numbers weren't numbers. Forest Service keeps a chain on it now. The gate's locked by 6. Pilot car was in it tonight, he said, more a fact than a challenge. Now and then folks see one, she said easy. My uncle kept a tow for the county back in the day. He said there was a season after they finished the new cut when people swore they followed a yellow bar for half a mile, and then it was the mesh catching lightning bugs. She topped off his cup as if that were part of the story. Truth is that old alignment wants company like any old road. It lays there thinking about the shape of tires. It tries it on, like a coat. Only way I know to keep yourself is check the things that don't get romantic. She ticked them off with a finger. Left reflector's amber, right reflector's white. Red means you're somebody else's wrong way. Clearance plates say what they say. And if a tunnel doesn't tell you how tall it is, you wait for daylight or you don't go at all. He smiled with his mouth and his shoulders both. That's a good list. She shrugged as if the list had been free with the coffee. World gets haunted, sure, she said. Friendly as a weather forecast. Mostly by the work it already did. He ate, and the chili did its honest work too. Back at the truck, the coils waited with the patience of metal that would go on being metal no matter what men asked of it. He checked his straps, as if he hadn't checked them already. He traced his hand along their edges, and felt the deliberate grip, the way nylon holds settle and bite. Above him, the stars had rearranged themselves in patterns people had been arguing about for longer than roads had existed. The rest of the night unrolled itself like a bolt of dark cloth. Smooth, a little glossy, easy to lay flat beneath wheels. He went down through the next valley and up the grade after, and let the engine sing the note that meant, "It's fine, I like this." He didn't see "follow me" again. He saw a possum in the right-of-way turn into a small, sensible ball and survive its own decision. He saw a deer lift its head and choose the forest over the two stripes of heat in the clearing. He saw at one point old rails shining with a frost skin beside the road where a branch line had been left to grow into the ground, and the crossbucks turned to gray teeth in his beams. His brain put the old things back where they belonged and let the new things do the work they were made for. At the drop to the river plain, dawn pretended to make up its mind. The horizon had a faint bar of color, like something painted in with a thumb, delicate as a bruise, and then decided to become morning after thinking it over for a while. He brought the truck to a stop on a spur outside the steel yard, while a man in a vest moved cones in a choreography that was all routine and all grace. Paperwork folded into paperwork. Scales spoke numbers that by rights should have sounded cold, and instead sounded like a greeting. A forklift sang its little reverse song. Work completed the circle. Later, after sleep, he would find a minute to search a satellite map and see, in that spectral high view, the old road hugging the new like a shadow that hadn't gotten the message. He would trace with a fingertip the spot where the tunnel lay like a dark eye in the stone. He would notice the way the type label for an old town didn't line up with any houses, because those houses didn't exist anymore except in photographs on diner walls. He would remember the message board that insisted he expect a pilot car, and he would think of how expectation can be a kind of road if you let it. On the wrap of his log that night, under the neat lines and the miles and the times, he wrote a little reminder to himself, plain as the reflectors and twice as steady. Check the amber. Check the white. Don't give your hideaway to anything that won't tell you its own. He rolled east again the next week and saw nothing at the red lamps but trees, and nothing at the tunnel but chains, and a padlock and a small metal sign screwed in tidy at eye height. Clearance 12-0, when open. He smiled because that was a number the world would live by. He didn't need to go through. He didn't need to prove anything. He let the new road have him. The 4-lane laid its hand on his shoulder and pressed down just enough to say, steady. He took it, and the mountain, the mesh, and the creek all breathed together the way they do when no one is trying to borrow a story from a place that has already told it. Story number 5. Sabine ran the river states at night the way some folks like to walk old neighborhoods quietly, with pockets of memory at the corners and a knack for noticing which lights in the houses are really on. The highway leveled out between levees and fields that held their stubble through winter, pale stalks combed flat by wind. Geese rode a black seam of sky overhead and spoke about it in low syllables. A faint ghost of fertilizer hung above the dark soil. Beyond that, water, smelled rather than seen, moving even when all the surface looked still. Her transponder, a little gray puck, tucked low on the windshield, made its polite, rare sound 20 miles shy of the state line. A single soft chirp. Bypass granted. She always thanked it aloud habit, not belief, and checked the green dot with a glance. The night ahead had the kind of calm that makes a driver honest about what's easy and what isn't. The dash glowed a modest amber. Her tires whispered a long sentence, and then a period each time the seam between slabs found them. Nothing asked anything hard. A sign mounted high on a steel gantry announced the way station 3 miles ahead. Another sign promised WEIGHINMOTION at highway speed. She felt it before she saw it. The faint ripple through the frame, the minuscule pitch change under the steer as the sensors written into the lanes did their quiet math. She'd been told those strips could read a truck the way a librarian reads a familiar spine on a shelf-weight distribution. Speed, even a sense of who was paying attention. It wasn't a bad trade. The road wants to know who's on it. Drivers want the road to want that. The next gantry didn't promise anything. It just laid out open in bright, efficient letters tall as her shoulder. Trucks must enter. The bypass puck didn't change its mind, but the sign wasn't asking, and a good way to get the road to treat you well is to act like a guest who remembers the rules of the house. Sabine signaled, eased off the cruise, and took the long, sweeping ramp toward the way station. Sodium lights turned the air a soft, pale orange. The lot was orderly in the way official lots are. Lanes painted straight, cones nested in their pairs like birds with somewhere to be, a mower parked square to its shadow. The scale house was a low rectangle with a glass front and a tiny porch just big enough for a smoke break. A simple flag hung limp beside the door. She expected to see a few idlers' company rigs stopped on their 10, an owner-operator polishing his headache rack for the pleasure of it, but the bays stood quiet and clear. She could hear the soft, restless sound of tall grass beyond the fence, and beneath it, the hush of the river moving parallel to all of this, as if indifferent to lines and lights. As she rolled toward the scale deck, a pre-war little chime sounded, polite to the point of quaint. The kind of tone a department store door made when someone walked in out of the wind. An overhead sign above lane 2 flicked from a blank black to slow green arrows that guided her onto the deck itself. On the windowed face of the scale house, a bank of red numerals woke up, numbers with too many zeros plus decimals that knew their place. Driver, bring her to 1 mile per hour. A voice said through the pole speaker, its metal grill catching her beams. The voice had the clean, informal authority of a person who had spent most of their life telling people what to do in a way that didn't make them want to argue front desk calm with a bit of gravel. All axles, keep it straight. Thank you. Sabine did as told. The scale deck looked like a piece of railroad built flat, slots running crosswise to swallow the edges of the plates. The plates themselves wore a fine skin of dew that made them seem to breathe. She rolled as instructed until the speaker clicked again. Hold, it said, and the red numerals froze. The steer axle weight displayed to the pound, then blinked and settled. The rears came next. The total at the end made sense in her bones. She knew, roughly, what she had under her. And these numbers were that song sung back to her. The printer to the right of the lane made its soft, busy sound. A slip spit into a small metal tray beside a swing-out armored glass. The little mouth of the world feeding a bit of paper into her hand like a fortune-telling machine that didn't require wishes. The slip was tidy, official-looking. It included the date, the time, her plates, gross, axle by axle, and then something she hadn't seen on a scale ticket since training, a line for stamp blank. Another line beneath it, as if the printer had reached into a drawer of formats older than the building itself, offered Weighmaster signature, also blank. A faint watermark showed a seal she couldn't quite place. The paper felt new between her fingers, not brittle, not yellow to sheet from now wearing typography from then. Proceed to secondary inspection, lane B, said the speaker, unbothered. She raised her eyes toward the bays. There were 3, A, B, and C, stenciled on the canted faces above doors, rolled up high enough for a superload. Bay B's door was at half-mast, 10 feet off the slab and waiting. No trucks, no figures. No traffic cones laid in a little curve to make a path. The fans that usually rinsed air out of spaces like this, sending dust and heat and diesel smell along a duct and away, were still. The quiet had a careful quality like a room prepared for guests who had been delayed. Sabine clicked her hazard lights on, 2 amber pulses that acknowledged, I hear you, and bought herself a common courtesy minute. She did what drivers do when something feels slightly out of column. She checked 3 simple things she trusted more than any voice. First, the clock on her dash true to the minute she had watched it be for a month. Second, the bypass puck, still holding its green. Third, the tiny printed number in the corner of the scale ticket zipped into being within the last breath, no timestamp from years gone sideways. The contemporary and the antique shared 1 scrap of paper without arguing. That in itself was fine. The world gets revised in layers. It was the emptiness that didn't quite sit. She keyed her CB even though she knew the valley swallowed chatter. Station running anybody near lane B? She asked, voice calm, just a line cast. Static eased across like a cat across a sill. No answer, no breath behind the noise. She set the mic back into its clip and watched her mirror. A set of headlights should have been following her in off the highway. There had been a bulk tanker 2 minutes back, and a lowboy a mile after that. The ramp behind her showed nothing but a clean curve, and the kind of shadow sodium lights paint on their own poles. The intercom clicked gently, an exact reproduction of a finger coming off a talk button. Lane B. Inspection. It prompted, as more patient than insistent. Sabine took 1 more slow look. The office windows shone, but against the glass, instead of a person moving through an ordinary frame of desk and bulletin board and coffee, she saw a jacket on a chair and a clipboard hung at an angle, and a wall clock with a white face and black sticks for hands. The minute hand pointed at the 7. Seconds did not move. When she turned her head and looked again, nothing changed except the knowledge that she had looked twice. She tried the posted phone number under the window, State Scale House, then an area code, and listened to the ring. It carried, then rolled to a message that said their hours for inbound inspections ran daylight and only daylight. It thanked her kindly and offered a second number for emergencies with the sort of practiced clarity that comes from a person who recorded the message in a quiet room 15 years ago and never had to think about it again. She could have gone into the bay. Her numbers were good. Her straps were tight. She had nothing in her log that wanted correcting, and nothing on the truck that wanted hiding. The reason she didn't was small and simple and had nothing to do with rules. The fans weren't on. Real work, liked air moving. Even at night, even in winter, even for a 20-second look at a fire extinguisher's tag, somebody somewhere flipped a switch that made a low utilitarian wind. Baby's ducks sat clean and unbothered, and the dust on the top lip of the door had not learned to wear fingerprints today. She kept her hazards on. She looked toward the exit lane, a tidy curve that sloped back to the highway. A red stoplight at its throat burned a steady circle. Above it, a sign that usually read, "Return to highway," or "Pull around for second," relit itself letter by letter, as if the bulbs were waking up into a thought. Exit, the letters found themselves, then wavered and rearranged. Inspect. Exit. Inspect. The confusion held for a few seconds. Then the panel resigned itself to being blank. Sabine made a decision the way she made all the ones that mattered at 3 a.m. deliberately, with generosity for whatever part of her would later wish she'd done it differently. "Scale, I'm going to exit," she said to the speaker, not when it clicked, but to the air. "Truck is in good order. If you need me to return, tell me now." The speaker did not answer. It had perhaps already said everything it knew how to say. The red lamp guarding the exit pooled its color into the fog that had slipped in from the river and settled along the low ground with the patience of water. She took her foot off the brake and rolled one full truck length. The light stayed red as if indifferent to her existence. She rolled one more, and then two, looked in the mirror, no one, and eased through. Some technologies like the respect. Some like to be told what they are. The gate did not drop and smack her hood, because there was no gate. Back on the on-ramp, the bypass puck made its muted chirp again, like a small bird remembering the nest. The highway took her as if she had never left it. Her mirrors showed the station slide backwards into its rectangle of light, and then into a duller glow, and then into nothing but the influence of a sodium light on mist. She drove for 20 minutes, then pulled into a combination gas and diner where the architecture hadn't made up its mind which decade to be. She parked under a light hung high enough to make its own weather and listened, with the engine off, to the vast thinness of the late hour. The reefer behind her kept its steady quiet. The insects that had made a racket in summer were down to a sparse set of dedicated winter voices. A freight train on the far side of the river spoke 3 notes and then filled them in with a long, trailing chord. Inside, the diner smelled like toast and the faint sweetness of syrup that had been warmed and reheated and warmed again. A man at the counter with forearms like hammers was working through a plate of eggs left-handed while he wrote something in a little notebook with his right. The woman behind the counter wore a cardigan the same gentle green as the vinyl stools and had a habit of setting mugs down with both hands like the contact mattered. "You running north or south?" she asked, voice friendly in the way of someone whose night shifts had taught her how to be everybody's neighbor for 20 minutes at a time. "North," Sabina said. "Handling light." "Station snag you?" the woman asked, unsarcastic. "Asked me," Sabine said, and slid the odd scale ticket out of her pocket so she could look at it under the bright. The paper looked normal. The numbers were right. The watermark, in this better light, resolved into an outline of the state, ringed with tiny dots like a constellation chart. The man at the counter chuckled a sound that had no unkindness in it. "Borrowed scale," he said without looking up from the page. "That's what my uncle called it," said when they poured the new pad. They set it right over a freight house foundation that didn't quite finish being what it was. And now and then the night will borrow the house and bring it up through the floor. You can weigh a train on a night like that if you want to, long as you promise to bring the numbers back. "Your uncle run trucks?" Sabine asked. "Ran the scale house," the man said, not prideful, just factual. He said most of what goes strange out there remembers rules. Numbers like to be right. People like things that tell them what they weigh. It's the parts around the edges that get odd. If the fans aren't on, it's not about you. If there's coffee, it's about you. The woman nodded as if to second that. "They got a cat most days," she said. "Gray, with a split ear. Mabel. If Mabel's sitting on the counter in the sun by the glass, you're good to hand over paper. If you don't see Mabel or smell coffee, you wave and you go." Sabine smiled without meaning to. That's a rule I can keep. People need something better than their own nerves to hang a decision on, the woman said, topping off a mug automatically. Where I grew up, it was whether the electric fence ticked. If it ticked, you knew someone had been out. Out there, it might be fans and cats. Sabine finished her coffee and sat in her booth until the space in her head where noise usually gathered had thinned out into something useful again. She thought about all the small things in her line of work that had, without anyone calling them holy, become ways of staying inside the lines. The way the rubber looked, where it met the tread, the way a strap's fuzz would tell you it had been working, the way a trailer makes a different, honest sound when a pallet has crept and needs finger and grunt. Maybe there was room in that practical little liturgy for a cat who only sometimes existed, and a set of fans that could be counted on to give themselves away. Back on the road, the night wore a little of the transparency that comes toward morning. The river to her right made a pale flat that showed water was there, even when it had stolen a color from the sky. She passed a sign she liked, next services 49 miles, and mentally counted her remaining sips. The highway rose to a low embankment and dipped again. In a patch where fog had learned to pool and decided to stay, she saw the faint glow of a way station's marker lights, and for a moment, imagined the place under them as two things at once. The tidy modern layout she had rolled through, and a shadow of old beams and a desk with a blotter and a brass stamp that smelled like ink and oil. By daylight, the idea softened. Her next drop took her near the state yard that shared a fence with the station. She stopped to confirm a permit at the window and saw, through the glass, a corkboard hung with comically stern posters and a photograph of a gray cat asleep in a cardboard box with the word files scrawled on it in marker. Beside the photo, a little piece of paper tacked up with a pushpin read in tidy capital letters, "If you see Mabel, you're in the right year." Someone had penned a smiley face next to it with exactly 2 dots and a sensible curve. On a Wednesday afternoon a month later, well awake and sun on the face of the scale house like honey on a plate, Sabine took the optional reway on a whim after coming off a steel yard light and empty. The door to Bay B stood open. Fans were on low, enough to make her hair think. A man in a vest with a coffee mug that said, "World's okayest waitmaster," leaned in the window and grinned the way people grin when they have not had to run amber lamps for 8 hours. Mabel lay with her front paws tucked under her like a loaf of bread, right where the sunlight made a rectangle on the warm counter. "Back for my stamp," Sabine said, and slid her odd ticket toward the man. He examined it like a currency dealer examines a note he already trusts. "Haven't seen one of these prints since my dad wore this vest," he said, not startled, only amused. "We keep a little file when they pop out. They're right, the numbers. They're always right. The rest is just the building talking to itself louder than usual. Keep this. It's good for nothing and good for luck." Mabel opened one eye, decided Sabine was not in possession of fish, and returned to her professional nap. The fans made their invisible river go where it needed to. The coffee smelled like coffee, and not like a memory of coffee. Outside, a line of trucks eased onto the deck and off again, each driver doing the same little dance of speed and brake and chin lift that meant everything was ordinary and fine. That night, Sabine rolled along a different river and watched mist behave the way mist always did, thick where invisible hollows waited, thin where a little wind skated in against it. The bypass pucks slept. No signs made more of themselves than they needed to. She thought about how a road can acquire, like a person does, layers of habits and ways of being seen that don't get erased by the new thing laid over the top. Old rail beds grow trees, but never stop running level. Boat ramps move, but the ground remembers that a heavy object once requested to be allowed into water and was obliged. Way houses count and count and count. And sometimes, when counting is not strictly required, the habit of it leaks through. On a page in the small notebook she kept in her door, she wrote down 3 lines the way people write recipes that work because someone stood at a stove long enough to know. Fans on, go ahead. Fans off, be kind, and roll on. If the coffee's hot and the cat is sleeping, you can hand over paper and breathe. The rest of the miles were just miles. The road held them. The truck answered them in its good, steady language. The river stayed where it had promised to, gathered into quiet shoulders by levees that wanted to be patient and were. When she caught her reflection in the side window, she didn't look like someone who believed in anything except simple tests. That had always been enough. The scale house lay back there making light in whatever year it needed to, the way some rooms in a life throw the same afternoon sun across the same table no matter how often a person measures their days. Story number 6. Harlan took the midnight stretch across the short grass plains because the sky there always felt like good company. The interstate lay flat as a ribbon set on a long table, and in the distance, the red wink of wind farm beacons kept their patient pulse, a choir of slow, synchronized beats that taught a person where the horizon was when the ground forgot to say. His flatbed rode light tonight, empty racks and binders coiled neat, headed to pick up pipe at dawn. He liked the way the truck handled without weight for a change, the softness in the wheel when he eased around a curve, the way the road returned sound to him like a room he knew. The night air was dry and friendly. Off to the south, a silo slept with its painted logo, turned toward nobody. Fences stepped away into dark fields, their posts lit briefly at the base by his headlights, then gone. He had a thermos he didn't need. The cool out here did the waking for him. The stereo stayed low, local station rolling through a late set of songs, half nostalgic, half new. He thought about a person he needed to call in the morning and let the thought go. Miles helped like that. Past a county line sign with a name most maps made small, he started to hear the road sing. It came like it always does in places where engineers cut grooves into the surface. A light buzz at the edge that turned to a shy tune when the spacing was just so. He'd driven novelty roads before those short stretches where, at exactly the posted speed, the pattern of rumble strips made a melody. Once, in New Mexico, he'd heard America the Beautiful in a dusty valley and laughed out loud at the way a highway had decided to be clever. Once, in California, a little tune he couldn't name had leapt up off the asphalt at 45 like children on a trampoline. It was a harmless kind of magic. A town got on TV for a week, a few tourists came through with phones held out, and then the grooves filled with sand, and the song went quiet. He rolled over a familiar whisper and smiled. Somebody out here had gotten a musical wild hair too. The note rose as he settled to 55, and then slid comfortably into a simple, pleasant melody he almost recognized. He slowed, and the pitch dropped with him. He sped up, and it rose, the way any grooved road will do. At 50, a phrase emerged. It wasn't a song he knew. It was the kind of tune somebody might whistle while going down a hallway to fetch something they had almost forgotten. His dash showed 12:37. The county name sign, the first hint of the song, the little stretch of fence with an extra brace post, he put them all in a small box in his head marked here, in case he wanted to find this again someday. People like to share surprises. Maybe on a slow afternoon he'd tell someone else where to drive for a free oddity. He let his speed sit where the notes felt happiest. The road returned the favor with smoothness, and the truck hummed along like it had been made for it. A mile later, the melody didn't stop. Musical roads were little things 200 yards. A novelty. 5 seconds of joke. This kept going, not loud, not intrusive, but present the way a polite conversation keeps a hand on your arm. Harlan adjusted his right hand on the wheel and felt the leather grip give him its familiar resistance. He checked the lane. The stripes were freshly painted, fair and bright. The shoulder was clean. The world had no reason to be anything other than itself. The tune shifted subtly. At 55, it moved into a phrase lower than his ear expected, then rose quicker than physics should have allowed when he nudged to 56. He raised an eyebrow the way a man will when a thing is off but not wrong. He put the truck at an even 53 and held. The melody adjusted to him as if it had been waiting. No novelty. Install could do that. Those grooves were cut once and committed. Your speed made the difference. The asphalt didn't get a vote. He tried the center of the lane, then drifted an inch left within the line, the way a person will when a lane is wide. The pitch wandered with him, sharpening by a hair like a guitar string being tuned. He frowned, not worried so much as curious, and let out a little breath that fogged the glass in a tiny circle close to his mouth and then vanished. Ahead, a low blue sign promised a rest area in 2 miles. Then another sign, brown and earnest, offered a scenic overlook for the stargazers. The wind turbines on the ridge to his left half laughed, each long blade drawing a slow arc that the red lights made precious. At the edges of the world, where land met sky, the faintest sheen said a river lay out there, wide and not in any hurry. The tune's soft, insistent stepped its way through another phrase, and then settled on a note that sat right at the edge of E, if his ear remembered anything from his mother's old piano. He gave the truck one more experiment, because small experiments kept a person honest. He clicked the cruise down 2 notches, and then, after a few seconds, tapped it up 3. In that middle, Right as he crossed a flat section of unremarkable asphalt where no grooves showed in his lights, the melody held steady. It rode a constant pitch that did not care what speed he chose. He took another breath and filed the fact away. The rest area appeared like a little village laid back from the interstate, its lamps glowing, a few semis parked nose out, as if already facing whatever the morning would ask. He touched his signal. The song lifted a note like a question in acknowledgement. He smiled at the absurdity of that and took the ramp anyway. The pavement on the ramp was the polished smooth of something poured last year. The grooves, if there were any, would have been cut after, and he didn't see them. The tune came all the same. He rolled to a stop in the far end of the truck lot, away from the handful of sleepers with their curtains pulled. He set his brake. The song did not end. It changed, as if the playing surface had been taken away, but the person doing the playing had simply set their instrument on their knee and kept going with a softer touch. Harlan sat without moving for 10 seconds and listened. The sound didn't come from the dash or the vents. It wasn't a human voice. It wasn't a radio. It was road noise arranged into notes, as surely as a farmer's fence will arrange wind into a harp if all the wires are singing. He cut the engine. The world unfolded a new layer of quiet. The tune remained very slight, living in the edges of tire whisper from trucks idling through, in the breath of the wind across a metal sign, in the slow rasp of a dryer vent somewhere over by the restroom door. He cracked his window and let the night come in. It carried sage and dust, and the ozone hint the turbines teased from the air. Far off, a coyote decided against saying anything and left the decision unmade. Harlan stepped down and stood on concrete that had held more hurried feet in daylight. Under the sodium lamps, the trees placed around the perimeter looked like puppets caught in the moment between play and being toys again. He walked to the boundary of the lot where the low fence separated asphalt from whatever counted as prairie here. The tune braided itself with the wind and seemed to float, as if it were written on the air itself and the highway merely sharpened it. He thought about silly things, how a road that played a melody would be a nice tourist gimmick for a county with more sky than museums. He thought about practical things, how water sometimes sets up standing waves in culverts and makes pipes sing all night if the angle is right. He thought about less comfortable things, how a person can follow a rhythm without thinking and wind up stepping where they're not supposed to. He rubbed his jaw once, like that was a switch that might change the station, and went back to the cab. On his dash lay a small couple of tools for nothing in particular. A postcard he kept as a bookmark in his atlas, a carpenter's pencil with the point shaved by knife, and a harmonica he didn't really play. The harmonica was a joke gift from someone who said if he was going to keep humming along to the CB, he might as well contribute. He picked it up now and blew a soft note to match the pitch he'd been listening to. The harmonica answered, a shade flat the way his untrained mouth tended to be. He bent it into tune. The note in the air and the note in his hand met like neighbors over a chain-link fence. He played one more, then slid the harmonica back where it belonged. The sound didn't swell in response. It didn't go away either. He finished the short rest he hadn't meant to take and eased back onto the interstate. The song strolled along beside him for a mile, maybe 2, and then drifted away like a conversation you leave behind in a diner when you open the door and let the bell have its say. He set the cruise, glanced at the wind farms, and let his shoulders forget they'd been thinking. The night rolled. 10 miles on, a blue sign announced a different exit. County 6, Old Town Historic Main Street. He hadn't been this way enough to have an opinion about the place. The old alignment ran parallel a few miles north, a pre-interstate 2-lane locals used to avoid everything about truck traffic. His GPS, a polite rectangle of light, kept its purple ribbon steady and asked nothing of him. The song came back. This time it entered abruptly, strong as if someone had turned a fader from 0 to 10. It wasn't the same set of notes. This was higher, brighter, a shape that wanted him at exactly 50. He looked at the needle. He was at exactly 50. He raised an eyebrow again without meaning to. He nudged up a mile per hour, then another. The tune rose with him like a well-behaved pet. He dropped to 48. The tune dropped too, but not by enough, as if it had to think about it. Harlan eased to the left lane and back to the right, feeling the world under him with the soles of his feet the way a person will when they don't quite trust the floor. The song tracked him. When he passed over an asphalt joint, the seam thumped new and plain, unmusical as a book closing. Old Town's exit ramp came up, no ramp lights, just the modest shape of a road curving down and away to a paralleled row of cottonwoods. On instinct, he let his gaze ride the sign a fraction longer than usual. There was a little white plaque under the green that said, "No trucks," except the text had the ghost of another beneath it. Older letters pressed into the metal through paint, a scar from an earlier rule. The kind of palimpsest happens when a town debates what it wants to be through a series of boards and meetings, and the signs make those debates visible. The song breathed left. It shifted a half step the way music does when someone changes keys midstream. The waver brought the hair on his forearms to attention. He did the simplest thing he knew to do when something thought it was leading. He put distance between himself and it. He cranked the cruise 2 clicks up and kept his hands steady. The melody hurried to keep pace, then stumbled just for a fraction of a second, just a hiccup of physics, and in the stumble he heard it not as song but as pieces. Wind at a cut fence, tires on a groove, the slice of air along the edge of a mirror. The hair on his arms lay down again. He breathed, the way a person breathes when they are still where they're supposed to be. An exit later, the sign for a scenic pull-off announced itself politely. A silver guardrail made a gentle ellipse around a little rectangle of pavement embraced by native grasses. A historical marker, brown and plain, stood there with the confidence of a paragraph that had been edited a dozen times and left alone. The melody softened again, as if willing to be subtle if he said please. He clicked on his right indicator not to take the pull-off, but to make a small, practical choice move over to let a white SUV that had appeared in his mirror pass on the left. The SUV slid by, steady, a couple in the front seats shaped by their headrests into silhouettes of people who would be home by 2. The melody surged at the moment the SUV drew even with his cab, and then desaturated like a photo left in the sun too long. When the taillights were red dots far ahead, the song was gone. Harlan laughed once, quietly. It was not disbelief or fear. It was relief dressed as humor. He drove the remaining stretch to the pickup yard with no music but his own engine. No song but the hum of new belts on old pulleys and the soft hiss of winter air down the mirror bracket. The turbines on the ridge blinked red and red and red, insisting the night was not empty but patterned. He liked patterns that told you what they were. At dawn, in the pale wash that makes every metal thing look colder than it is, he parked on the gravel by the gate to the pipe yard and went to sign in. The man in the office had the kind of hands that had known rope and chalk and now knew paper. They chatted about everything people chat about at dawn sheet ice under the overpass. A game no one had watched live but everyone had opinions about. The coffee machine promising more than it delivered. County cut themselves a song back there a few years ago. The man said, unprompted, twirling a pen the way a person will when even their fingers like patterns. Ain't supposed to be on the main out on that farm to market road runs parallel to ours. People complained. It woke up cattle. Tourists hit the speed and then hit the ditch. County filled the grooves. You can still hear something on real quiet nights. Folks say the wind plays what it remembers. Harlan signed where the man pointed and slid the clipboard back. Heard something like that, he said. The man shrugged amiably. Years put layers on a place. This county has dust older than my uncle's stories. Sometimes it all talks at once. Doesn't mean it's for you. I go by instruments. If the speed says 53, I do 53. If my wife says I need to be home by 6, I do 6. He grinned with the exact shape of someone who has been late often enough to learn the consequences. After his pickup, strapped and checked, Harlan headed back out with the sun well up. The night had folded itself away, and the turbines looked less like beacons and more like sculptures. He aimed his eyes at the places where he thought the melodies had been and saw nothing but road. Asphalt looked like asphalt. Grooves looked like the ordinary ribbing that keeps tires honest when rain wants mischief. At the rest area, a groundskeeper in a green cap emptied bins, and the trees were trees in day clothes. The breeze made the same music as fences always make. He rolled through without stopping and took his miles easy. Weeks later, running the opposite direction under a sky milk blue and busy with thin cloud, he took the old 2-lane parallel on purpose. The county had posted a sign explaining the novelty road that had once lived there, and beneath it another sign apologizing for having had to grind the grooves down, citing safety and cattle and peace. The local paper in the little town's diner kept a clipping in their front window, a black and white photo of a group of smiling kids in folding chairs by the edge of a field, listening to a road sing. Time had fixed its piece of fun to the bulletin board like a leaf pressed in a book. He ate lunch near a window where sunlight broke into actual squares on the floor and watched a dog asleep in one of them take slow, contented breaths. The world liked its patterns. He liked his. On a napkin, he wrote himself a plain reminder with his carpenter's pencil, not because he would forget, but because it felt like luck to put it down. If a road hums you a tune, check the speed with your speed, check the lines with your eyes, and if a melody starts making choices on your behalf, step out of the dance and let it find somebody else to teach. Some nights after that, the wind across the plains would gather itself into a voice that made no demands and offered no instructions. Harlan would hear hints of notes in the far-off beacon's rhythm, or in the way tires on the next lane over, and fell into step, and he'd think of how the world loves a repeating thing. He'd keep his pace, not out of stiffness, but out of a preference for the simple proofs. Mile markers counting the way they count, the needle steady on a number he chose, the exit signs arriving in the order the map had promised. The plains lifted and fell under him like a calm sea. The fence lines wrote their thin cursive along the edges. Long after the novelty grooves had been ground into quiet, something out there would still gather edge and air into a measure or two on a clear night. He didn't mind it. He didn't follow it either. He kept the melody where it belonged in the cab if he wanted it, in the road if he didn't, and let the highway do the only work it ever really asks of anyone. Go forward, keep steady, arrive. As the rumble of the last story fades into silence, remember some roads hold memories that never rest. The darkness beyond the headlights isn't always empty. Sometimes, it's listening, waiting for the next traveler to pass through. If you've made it to the end, you've got the courage of a true night driver. Don't forget to like this video, share your own chilling road tales in the comments, and subscribe to The Sleep Haunt, where the highway never truly sleeps. Sleep well, if you can.